Welcome back for another Sheriff Custodian video. It's time today to answer your questions related to away rotations. Now, as always, the questions are real questions from real readers and viewers, but I take the liberty of simplifying and anonymizing them to try to make the answer more generalizable and hopefully more useful to more than just one particular person. But for a topic like this, it's kind of hard to do that because your unique situation, your goals, your competitiveness, the options available to you, a bunch of stuff, ultimately answer the questions that I'm going to answer here. So unlike some of the stuff that I've talked about, like, the personal statement mailbag or the letters of intent mailbag, where I could give you advice that I thought would apply to most or even almost everyone, this is one where you're going to have to apply my principles to your particular circumstances. So let's get into it. First question, should I do an away rotation? Now, this question may surprise some of you because I think we've reached the point in 2024 where doing away rotations has become the default. But there's actually a few important things to consider, and the viewer who inspired this question had done a very thorough and honest analysis of her situation and felt that maybe she shouldn't. And I actually agreed with her. So let's start the mailbag today by thinking about when you should and when you maybe shouldn't do an away rotation. There are two good reasons that you might want to do an away rotation. The first one is that you want to see the program. So if you think someplace is your number one, or if you wonder if a certain city is all that it's cracked up to be, or if living in some other city is actually safe and manageable, or if you just want to see if you vibe with the residents and attendings at a certain place, then do an away rotation there. Try it on and see if it fits. That's a good reason to do an away rotation, and you certainly don't need any advice or permission from some guy on the internet to do it. But clearly, a simple and earnest desire to learn more about a program is not what is driving larger and larger number of students each year to do away rotations. These days, the average student doesn't care so much about seeing the program as they care about the program seeing them. They're trying to achieve a benefit in the match. And if that's what you're trying to accomplish, well, now the decision in front of you is not strictly a personal decision. It's actually a strategic decision, and you should analyze it through a strategic lens. Because away rotations are a double-edged sword. The reason that programs like them and the reason that they weigh performance on away rotations so very heavily when they rank applicants is because they get to try you on. Are you a good fit for them? And you need to know that the answer to that question is not always yes. Every year I hear from a few applicants who were unsuccessful in the match and they reach out to me for advice during SOAP. And if you've watched my video on what to do if you don't match, then this is a familiar graphic to you and you already know my basic approach to this, and I'm not going to bore you with it here. But basically the first thing that I try to do is figure out why they didn't match in the first place, because that helps determine the optimal strategy going forward. And sometimes that reason is obvious, but sometimes I hear from applicants who went unmatched despite seeming to have a great application on paper. But these applicants, they didn't get very many interviews. And when I hear that kind of story, the differential diagnosis has three things. It could be that the applicant has some unknown red flag, a negative comment in their letter of recommendation, for example. Or it could be that they miscalibrated their competitiveness when they were deciding which programs to signal. And so one way I'll get at that is by exploring what their interview yield was from the programs that they signaled and from programs where they did their aways. And sometimes when I do that, I stumble onto a different diagnosis altogether because I'll learn that there was an unusual difference in the interview yield for programs that they signaled but didn't do an away and programs where they did an away. Now, you would expect that your interview yield would be the highest for programs where you did away rotations, and usually it is. But when you see somebody who got more interview offers from the residency programs that only saw them on paper, it means the programs who saw them up close didn't like what they saw, or that they rotated at the wrong places, or some combination of both. Regardless, in these cases, doing away rotations, or at least doing the away rotations that they did, it didn't help them match. It hurt them. My point is, if your goal in doing an away rotation is to increase your chance of matching, then you need to think carefully about whether doing an away rotation or whether doing an away rotation at that program is actually going to help you do that. And I think there's a few things that go into that decision, and I'm going to walk you through them right now. The first thing to consider is what specialty you're applying to. If you're applying to a highly competitive specialty, plastic surgery, neurosurgery, orthopedic surgery, dermatology, otolaryngology, urology, whatever, whether or not to do an away is not really a question. You absolutely need to do an away. The only question is where you should do it, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But on the other hand, if you're applying in a less competitive specialty, where programs are larger, things like internal medicine or pediatrics or emergency medicine, then you do not need to do away rotations to match. So whether you should or shouldn't, it depends on where you fall on the other dimensions that I'm going to mention. But let me show you some data first. This is an older study, but I like it because it includes almost every specialty on a single table. So what I want you to see is that in some specialties, like neurosurgery or plastic surgery, 100% of respondents did away rotations, or what they called in this article, visiting rotations, or VR. 98.8% of orthopedic surgery applicants did aways. 92.9% of otolaryngology applicants did. On the other hand, though, we see only 55% of pediatrics applicants and 43% of internal medicine applicants did. Now, I want you also, though, to look at that far right-hand column, which shows the percentage of applicants who did aways who matched at the program where they did their away rotation. 56% of orthopedic surgery applicants matched to a program where they did an away. 47% in dermatology. 44% in plastic surgery. These are big numbers. And again, these data have limitations. These are survey data, and they're from a few years ago. So since this survey was done, radiation oncology and emergency medicine have become significantly less competitive, and anesthesiology has become significantly more competitive. So I don't think those percentages would hold up today. But nonetheless, these kind of data, they give you a general sense of the lay of the land. And my point is, the more competitive the specialty, the more it becomes obligatory that you do away rotations. If you're not applying in one of those hyper-competitive specialties, then the next dimension you need to consider when you want to decide if you personally should do an away rotation is to look at your own competitiveness as an applicant. This one's real simple. The better you look on paper, the less you have to gain by doing an away rotation, and the more you have potentially to lose. If you have USMLE scores and research metrics that are above average for the specialty, or if you come from a very highly regarded medical school, you're probably going to get an interview without doing an away rotation. So why would you make the program second guess that? On the other hand, if you're a less competitive applicant, if your application is at risk of getting screened out before someone even reads it, then an away rotation would almost certainly help you. So if you look good on paper and you're not applying in a surgical subspecialty, the final dimension you ought to consider before doing an away rotation is how good you think you're going to look on that away rotation. And here the key thing is to be honest with yourself. The classic phenotype of a student who does well on an away rotation is someone who's a quick learner, someone who can show up in an entirely new hospital system and learn the EMR and figure out where the bathrooms are and learn who's who and how work gets done without a whole lot of on-the-job training. This kind of student has high agency. They feel comfortable jumping in and doing things without a lot of hand-holding. This phenotype of student tends to be extroverted and capable of ingratiating themselves with new people easily. But even if they're not, they know how to read the room and they don't get ignored or come on too strong. On the other hand, there are other phenotypes of students who don't tend to shine as much on away rotations. If you're quieter, more introverted, you may go on to be a diligent and trustworthy physician, but you may not shine as brightly as some others in a 2 to 4 week audition rotation with a rotating cast of characters in an unfamiliar location. So if you're the kind of student who feels like you're only getting comfortable with a given rotation by the time that rotation's about to end, or if you're the kind of student who likes to shadow for a while before you do something yourself, away rotations are probably not going to be in your wheelhouse. Or, actually, here's another. If you're an extrovert, but you're so extroverted that you've kind of noticed in your life that some people immediately love you and others seem kind of annoyed by you, even though you've never really understood why, well, you might not want to do an away rotation. You might do better with great letters of recommendation from the faculty at your home institution who you get to pick and who you know like your style, instead of risking doing an away rotation with a serious-minded senior resident who doesn't appreciate your sense of humor or movie quotes or inside jokes or the fact that you walk down the hall singing whatever song is in your head. Again, you got to be honest with yourself, both about what your strengths and weaknesses are and about how other people are likely to see you. Anyhow, when you put all these three axes together, you can make a strategic decision about whether you ought to do an away rotation. For some of you, this is going to be easy. It will be obvious to many of you after hearing this that you need to do an away rotation. And for some of you, it may be obvious that maybe you shouldn't. But there's going to be some of you who are in a gray area. Maybe you're applying in a somewhat competitive field and you're an average applicant, but you're a little worried that you don't fit the phenotype of the classic successful away rotator. If that's the case, then you may want to think carefully about the type of away rotation that you do. Maybe you want to rotate with the ID service, where you'll be working with just the attending and the fellow, instead of doing the cardiology rotation, where you're going to be playing Texas Whip Out every morning on ward rounds. This kind of gets back to the point that I said at the beginning of the video, which is that all I can do is tell you the strategic principles, but everyone's circumstances are different, and so you've got to apply those principles to your own situation. Next question. Where should I do my away rotations? So there's lots of personal reasons that you might want to explore one program or another, and all those reasons, like I said before, are absolutely valid and valuable. But I'm going to answer this question only through the lens of strategy. And to do that, I think you got to acknowledge two things. First, away rotations can be an extremely impactful component of your application. Second, you can't do away rotations everywhere. The realities of time and space are going to put a natural cap on the number of programs where you can do away rotations before rank ordered list submission is due. The point is, you need to view your away rotations as being a valuable and scarce resource that needs to be used as efficiently as possible. I think you should go through the same exercise that I recommended in my video on strategic preference signaling. If you haven't seen that one, I'll link to it in the notes below, but basically you start with a list of all the programs where, in your heart of hearts, you'd most like to match. Then you look at that list and you think about how likely it is that you might get an interview or match at those programs without doing an away. And of course, you can't do this precisely, but you should use all the data that are available to you, which I cataloged in that preference signaling video, so that you can broadly estimate that probability. Maybe come up with a scale like the one I've got shown here. And if you did, you'll soon recognize that the most strategic decision is going to be to target programs that are in these middle categories. There's no strategic value in using an away rotation to get an interview at a place that was already going to give you an interview. You do not want to expend a scarce resource to get something that you were going to get anyway. The only exception to this would be if you have some program that's so far and away your number one choice that even a 95% or a 97% chance of getting an interview without doing an away rotation, that would be unacceptably low. But at the same time, it's also a very bad strategic decision to waste an away rotation on a program where you have a very low chance of matching. And to be honest, this is more frequently where I see people go wrong. There are people that say, I know I'm not the best applicant on paper, but I'm going to shoot my shot. I'm going to get up in there at this big name program and I'm going to knock their socks off. And they get up in there and they do fine. They have a good rotation. But the program director's socks remain firmly attached to their feet, and when it comes time to rank applicants, they end up choosing people who had just as good away rotations, but looked better on paper. It is okay if you want to take a crack at your dream program. But if you're applying in a competitive specialty, or if you perceive that you may be a borderline applicant, you need to prioritize matching, period. Above the transient dopamine burst that you'd get by having a big name program on that little placard that you get to hold up on your school's match day ceremony. And here I'll admit, maybe I'm showing my bias. If you follow this channel, you probably know that I think there's too much priority placed on prestige programs. But I want you to know, and maybe this is a good time to talk about it, that opinion that I have, it's informed by the stories that I hear. And I hear the worst stories. I mean, I realize there's selection bias in the stories that I get to hear. If you're the kind of applicant who ignored the haters and you beat all odds to match at your dream Ivy League program, you don't tell me that story. You tell that story on Instagram. You don't end up in my DMs or email inbox. But every year, I do hear from some very talented applicants who overreached or they misplayed their hand in some minor way or another, and they end up without a seat when the music stops on Monday of match week. In my opinion, the difference between matching in a big name program or a less known or even an unknown program, it may sting a little bit on match day, but it really isn't going to make a difference when you're 10 or 15 years into your career. However, there can be a wide gulf between going matched and unmatched, and many people who end up on the wrong side of that divide, they have their entire career trajectory altered. So if you want advice about shooting the moon so that even if you miss, you'll land among the stars, I'm going to refer you to your aunt's Facebook page. If you want my advice, then here it is, and I cannot emphasize this strongly enough. That advice is that you need to make sure that you create at least some chances for yourself at programs that you could love, but that are also likely to love you back. So when you pick your away rotations, make sure that you match the profile of a resident in the program, not just the minimum requirements that are needed to rotate there. All right, next question, which really is a related question. Should I rotate at a big name place even though I'm not competitive as an applicant there? So in this particular situation, the student who messaged me was surprised to be accepted to rotate at a big name institution. But he had done his homework, and he knew that his application probably wasn't going to be competitive to actually match at that residency program. And actually, someone from his school had done this same rotation last year, and they were not offered an interview at the program. But they did get a letter of recommendation, and there was speculation that that letter, since it came from such a big name place, it had helped the student match into a different program in the same specialty. So the question is, could you end up with more shots on goal by rotating at a big name place, even if that place probably isn't going to interview you? So I love this question, and I guess it's possible that it could work out in your favor, but my answer is no. I would not recommend doing this. And I say that because of what I highlighted earlier. Your away rotations, if you choose to do them, they are a valuable and limited resource. And I think they have greater value if you use them to increase your probability of matching at the institution where you rotate, rather than hoping that that translates to some benefit elsewhere. I mean, letters of recommendation help, but honestly, there isn't that much discriminatory value in probably 85% of applicants' letters. So compared to an average or a typical letter, a really good letter of recommendation still is only going to get you an extra interview on the margins. And even then, the probability that you'd even get a really good letter is uncertain. So you have to consider that downside risk. And if that downside risk isn't at least outweighed by the upside probability that a really good elective would open doors for you at that program, then I don't think that the expected value is going to end up working out in your favor. All right, one last question. How do I rock my away rotations? Here I gotta say that pure personal advice questions like this are not exactly in my particular area of expertise, or even necessarily what I want this channel to be about. But since you asked, I'm gonna take a crack at it. And honestly, most of what you need to do, it's Medical Student 101. I mean, anyone who's getting ready to match, you ought to know most of this stuff already. First, be honest. Don't say you examined something or saw something if you didn't. I know that's uncomfortable, but you really don't come back from being caught in a lie. It's proof positive that you care more about looking good on rounds than you do about actually taking care of the patient. Second, write things down. When I was an intern, someone told me that there's two kinds of interns, those who forget things and those who write things down. And I gotta say, I found that to be true. So I guess you gotta decide which kind of intern you want to be. Number 3, follow through. There is an incredible power in saying what you're gonna do and then doing that thing. Be reliable. Number 4, be professional. Don't make any joke that you wouldn't want your mother to hear. Don't joke about patience, ever. Don't comment on someone's appearance, even if you think it's a compliment. Just don't. And I realize there are certain people who will like you better if you ignore this and you participate in the slapstick humor or the locker room humor. But you asked me for advice, and my strong advice, both for your audition rotations and for your future career, is just don't. Number 5, don't complain. Even if other people around you are complaining. It may seem like you're just blowing off steam. You might actually think that you feel better afterward. But I promise you this, the more complaining you do, the harder the work gets for everyone. Next, pay attention. There's a steep learning curve when you start a new rotation in a new hospital. You make it even steeper if you make people tell you the same thing twice. Every institution has its own culture, and every service has its own workflow. You're going to learn those things faster if you're actively paying attention. Next, dress nicely. I know the issue of professional dress has been scrutinized over the past few years, and I know there are thoughtful people in academic medicine who believe that certain standards of professional dress have been weaponized against marginalized people or groups and used to maintain biased hierarchies in our profession. My advice would be to fight that fight when you're a faculty member, not when you're a visiting student on an audition rotation. Be on time. When you show up late, you make people think that you're either disorganized or you're selfish. And neither of those things is good. If rounds start at 7, unless you are giving or receiving chest compressions, make sure that you're there at 6:55. And if, through some unavoidable act of God, you have to be late, and you have a paper cup of coffee in your hand or a plate of food in your hand, throw those things away before anyone sees you show up late with that stuff in your hand. You are better off to be hungry or uncaffeinated than to have someone draw inference about why you showed up late. Last, always have something to read. If you haven't figured it out already, your days of having large, uninterrupted blocks of time to just dig in and grind out hours and hours of studying, those days are gone forever by the time you hit your third year. In the future, you've got to be able to squeeze productivity out of smaller chunks of time. And learning how to do that may be uncomfortable, but I promise that's going to benefit you throughout your career. So print out an article from Up to Date or a journal and keep it in your pocket for when you have a few minutes between cases or between patients in clinic. And you may notice I said print it out because, again, we're talking about audition rotations, and seeing someone read something on paper makes a different impression than seeing someone staring at their phone, even if in actuality they're doing the exact same thing. Like I said, this stuff is medical school 101. This is the bare minimum. If you don't do these things that I've already said and you bomb your away rotation, well, brother, I don't know what to tell you. But if you got all that stuff down pat, then I'll go ahead and give you 3 other quick pieces of advice. First one is this: be the kind of person that you'd want to work with. Before you do your away rotation, spend a few minutes in thought about the kind of people that you have most enjoyed working with during your third year. Why did you like working with them? Write it down. Then I want you to scratch through all the ones where you wrote down that person let you leave early, because that's not going to help you on your way rotations. Instead, I want you to look at the ones that are left. And everybody's list is going to be a little different, but I think there's going to be some commonalities. People like to work with people who are happy and energetic, but not obnoxiously so. They like to work with people who care. They care about the quality of the work they produce, and they're trustworthy and reliable in doing that work. People like to work with people who are even-keeled and people who look out for others instead of just trying to make themselves shine. They like people who are smart, unless those people rub it in other people's faces. I promise you, doing this exercise is worth a few minutes of your time. Spend some time thinking about what you want your personal brand to be. And then, when you go into your away rotation, be that person. Second, learn to carefully observe. Not just see things, but carefully observe. When you walk in and you go to round on your patient in the morning, pause at the door and make sure when you walk into that space that you do so with your eyes open wide so that you notice everything. Open your eyes. I want you to catalog all their lines and drains. I want you to see what's hanging from the IV. I want you to see what your eyes tell you, not just what Epic says. What are the vitals on the monitor at that very minute? What does the urine in the Foley look like, or the fluid in the JP? I want you to examine the abdomen or whatever you're trying to look at, and do it like you're trying to memorize some cartoon in Sketchy. Open your eyes wide enough to see what else is in the room. What do the nurses write on the whiteboard? How much food was eaten on the tray? What objects are lying around as clues to tell you who's been there visiting? Too many residents and medical students walk into a patient room the same way that they walk into their own living room, like it's a place that you've been 1,000 times and you only got to see well enough to not trip. I want you to not do that. I want you to fix a mental image of everything that you see in your mind, because it will give you a much richer understanding of your patient and much better substrate to inform decisions, and you're going to be that much more useful to your patient and to your team. And that brings me to my third and final piece of advice, which actually is the biggie. Be useful to the team. If any of you have read The House of God, you may recall rule number 11. Show me a medical student who only triples my work, and I'll kiss his feet. Be that medical student. Some students, they get the wrong idea about what makes you look good on a rotation. It's not about giving a perfectly rehearsed presentation. And it's certainly not about blurting out the answer to some random trivia question that got asked to someone else when you were on rounds. It's about making yourself useful to the team in actually helping the team get work done. Good medical students, they do the things that people tell them to do. But great medical students see work that needs to be done, and they don't hesitate to jump in and do it, to lend a hand with the actual work of patient care. So don't overstep your bounds, but if you're paying attention, every day on rounds generates a lot of little tasks that you can do. Be the one who calls the outside hospital and checks on that culture that got done before they got transferred. Be the person who tracks down the patient's last EKG or op report. Call the nursing home. Talk to the staff. Figure out the patient's real baseline. Confirm the pharmacy for the discharge medications. Talk to friends or family members for your psychiatry patients so that you can get useful collateral information. Get on the phone and update the daughter in California. These are all time-consuming and often thankless tasks, but they actually improve patient care. And honestly, that's what it's all about. I feel like, really, just in the time since I was a medical student, there's been a shift in the way that many students view their third-year rotations. Those core clerkships, they've gone from being a safe, formative educational experience to being a nearly completely performative endeavor where the priority is on showing no weakness to the attending and presenting yourself only in the best light possible. Students know how the game's played. And so for many students, the dominant strategy is you show up, you try to look good on rounds, then you leave as early as possible so that you can study for the shelf. And you don't have to tell me, I obviously understand why this shift has occurred. But when you make your transition to residency, things change. What you do will actually matter more than how you appear, and that is something that is both joyful and daunting. And as a senior medical student who's looking at away rotations, you should recognize that even now you're starting to make that transition. I mean, there ain't no more shelf exams that you got to worry with. You will soon be on the front lines of real patient care, and my single best piece of advice to you is to seize your away rotation as an opportunity to embrace that role. And for now, that's all I've got. Thanks for listening.